She's gone. Mark her KIA. We move now. David Hayes said those words while Sarah Jenkins was still breathing, still bleeding into the dirt, still alive under 3 feet of rubble with her fingers curled around a weapon she hadn't finished using. He didn't send a search team. He didn't wait for confirmation. He pulled his men out, boarded the extraction bird, and filed the paperwork before the rotors stopped spinning. A U.S. Navy SEAL, his best operator, buried alive in enemy territory, and he called it a loss in under 4 minutes. Not because he believed she was dead, because he needed her to be. Subscribe now. Drop your city in the comments below and find out what happens when the woman you buried decides to walk back out of that desert dragging your worst nightmare behind her. The briefing room at Naval Air Station Coronado smelled like burnt coffee and old ambition. It always did at 0200 hours, when the kind of missions that never made the news were handed down in manila folders, thick with classified photographs and whispered death sentences. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Jenkins sat at the far end of the steel table, her hands flat on the surface, her eyes moving methodically across the satellite imagery spread in front of her. She had done this 100 times. The posture, the stillness, the deliberate calm, it wasn't something they taught you at BUD/S. It was something you earned the hard way through years of watching men panic and deciding quietly and permanently that you would never be one of them. She was 32 years old. She had 11 years of special operations experience behind her. She had been to Fallujah, Kandahar, Djibouti, and a dozen other places the Pentagon preferred not to mention in open session. She had 3 commendations, 2 Purple Hearts, and a reputation inside the teams that made senior enlisted men speak carefully when they addressed her. She was not the kind of woman who needed to announce herself. The record did that for her. Lieutenant Commander David Hayes did not see the record. He saw what he always saw when he looked at Sarah Jenkins, an anomaly he hadn't asked for and didn't know what to do with. He walked into the briefing room 7 minutes late, which was itself a statement. Hayes was never late by accident. He set his coffee on the table, looked around at the 6 operators assembled there, and when his eyes reached Sarah, they stopped just long enough to register something that wasn't quite contempt. It was something more precise than that. It was dismissal. "All right," he said, dropping into his chair at the head of the table. "Let's talk about al-Bashari." The name landed in the room like a stone into still water. Omar al-Bashari, Syrian-born Mexican cartel connected operating out of a fortified compound 23 kilometers south of the New Mexico border. He had been moving Tier 1 weapons, MANPADS crew, served machine guns, military-grade explosives into the hands of organizations that had already used them against American personnel. 17 dead over the last 18 months, all traced back to material that came through al-Bashari's pipeline. The intelligence community had been hunting him for 4 years. 3 previous attempts to capture or neutralize him had failed, the last one catastrophically leaving 2 operators dead and 1 in a Walter Reed bed he would never fully leave. Intel puts his security force at 60 to 80 personnel. Hayes continued tapping the satellite photo. Compound has 3 perimeter walls, 2 guard towers, and a subterranean network we've mapped to about 60% confidence. The plan is a night assault Black Hawk insertion breach, the outer wall here, and here Alpha Team takes the main building. Bravo Team secures the perimeter and cuts the communications node. We grab al-Bashari, we're wheels up in 20 minutes. He looked around the table. Questions? Sarah spoke without raising her hand. She never raised her hand. The 60 to 80 estimate, what's the sourcing on that? Hayes looked at her with the patient expression of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. Human intelligence, confirmed by 2 separate assets. 2 assets working the same network, she said, or independent sources. A beat of silence. Petty Officer First Class Tommy Riggs, sitting 2 seats to Sarah's left, kept his eyes forward, but she could see his jaw tighten slightly. He knew what was coming. They were cross-referenced, Hayes said. That's not what I asked, Sarah said. Her voice was level, not challenging, factual. If they're drawing from the same network, they're not independent confirmation. They're the same data point told twice. And if the estimate's wrong, the estimate is solid, Chief Jenkins. Hayes' voice dropped half a register. This isn't the time for a seminar on intelligence methodology. With respect, sir, it is exactly the time. The room went quiet in a way that had texture to it. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, a 14-year veteran sitting across from Sarah, looked down at the table. He agreed with her. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, but he wasn't going to say so. not with Hayes sitting at the head of that table radiating authority and resentment in equal measure. The estimate is solid, Hayes repeated, and his tone made clear the conversation was over. 60 to 80 combatants. We've planned for 80 plus. We're covered. Sarah looked at him for one more second. Then she looked back at the satellite imagery. She memorized the canyon network east of the compound. She memorized the elevation changes, the choke points, the shadows that a thermal camera would read differently than visible light. She did this not because she planned to end up alone in those canyons. She did it because 11 years had taught her that plans were what you made before reality introduced itself. The mission briefing lasted another 40 minutes. Hayes spoke for most of it. When Sarah offered 2 additional tactical suggestions, a modified breach sequence that would reduce exposure time at the outer wall, and a contingency exfil route that didn't depend on the primary L's being clean, Hayes acknowledged both with the particular brevity of a man filing something directly into the trash. When the briefing broke, the team filtered out into the corridor to gear up. Tommy Riggs fell into step beside Sarah, close enough to speak quietly. "He's wrong about the intel," Tommy said. "I know. You think it's going to be worse than 85? She glanced at him sideways. Tommy was 27 from Biloxi, Mississippi, and had the earnest face of someone who still occasionally surprised himself with how good he was at violence. He was the best breacher on the team, and the only person in the unit who had never once treated Sarah as if her presence required explanation. "I think we should be ready for significantly worse," she said. "Keep your secondary mag accessible and your radio double-checked. Don't rely on the primary LZ." Tommy nodded. "You going to be okay with Hayes running this?" Sarah stopped walking. She turned to look at him. "I'm going to do my job," she said. "That's all I've ever done." He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded, something resolving in his expression. "Yes, ma'am." She almost corrected him. She was a chief, not an officer. Ma'am was for the commissioned side of the house. But she let it go. Some things you let go. The equipment bay was organized chaos. Operators checked and rechecked their kit with the methodical intensity of people who knew that everything from this point forward was downstream of whether a buckle was properly secured or a radio battery was fully charged. Sarah moved through her pre-mission check with the efficiency of someone for whom this was muscle memory. SC-ARH was suppressor in PEQ 15. Glock 19 as secondary. IFAK, individual first aid kit with 2 tourniquets. Hemostatic gauze, a chest seal, and a decompression needle. Night vision on the helmet mount. Radio with fresh battery backup radio in her kit. 3 days of water in the Camelback. That last item, 3 days of water. She told herself it was standard desert protocol. She told herself it was nothing more than professional habit. But somewhere in the operational hindbrain, that 11 years of special operations service had developed in her like a second nervous system. Something had calculated the canyon distances from the compound to the nearest American position and come back with a number. The number was not comfortable. She pushed it down. She finished her check. She was ready. Hayes found her as she was moving toward the flight line. He stopped her with a hand on her arm, not aggressive but deliberate, and waited until the other operators had moved ahead. Then he looked at her with an expression she recognized as one people used when they had decided to be honest and had confused honesty with cruelty. "I want you on perimeter security tonight," he said. "Bravo team east wall. Webb takes point on the breach." Sarah went very still. "I'm the team's senior enlisted operator." "You are. And you're putting me on perimeter security. I'm placing you where the mission needs you." She held his gaze. "With respect, Commander, this is a demotion and function on the night of a high-risk mission. You want to tell me the actual reason?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt. Hayes wasn't the type to carry guilt easily. It was something more like calculation, a man deciding how much of his hand to show. "I need operators I'm confident in on the primary objective," he said. The words landed. Sarah absorbed them. She breathed. She breathed again. "I've run 17 direct action missions," she said. Her voice was still level. This was the remarkable thing about Sarah Jenkins, that she could stand in a room with a man who was actively shrinking her, and she would not shrink. "I have a 0 mission failure record. You are telling me that you lack confidence in me based on criteria you have never articulated and that are not reflected in any performance evaluation in my jacket. That's what you're telling me." "I'm telling you the mission assignment," Hayes said. "Then put it in writing," she said. "Right now before we board. Put it in writing." He blinked. just once. But it was the blink of a man who had not expected that. That's not, put it in writing, Commander. If it's a legitimate tactical decision, documentation takes 30 seconds. If you're not willing to document it, then we both know what this actually is. The flight line noise filtered in from outside, rotors beginning to spin, time compressing the way it always did before a mission, the world accelerating toward the point of no return. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, almost pleasantly, "East Wall Chief, perimeter security, that's your assignment." He walked away. Sarah watched him go. Tommy appeared at her shoulder. He had seen enough of it to understand. His expression was careful. "You okay?" "Yes," she said. We're going to do our jobs," she said. "Get to the bird." They boarded the Black Hawk at 0310 hours. 8 operators plus 2 aircrew. The interior smelled of hydraulic fluid and neoprene. Sarah sat near the door, her back against the airframe, and watched the desert scroll away below them through the gap, a moonscape of silver-gray scrub and broken rock that didn't care about any of them at all. She ran through the contingencies again, the canyon network, the distances, the water in her camelback. She told herself it was professional habit, but the operational hindbrain had already made its calculations, and it was not done with her yet. The flight took 41 minutes. At 35 minutes out, the crew chief moved through the cabin and held up 5 fingers. 5 minutes. The red jump lights came on, bathing the interior in a color that had no civilian equivalent. Not danger exactly, but the precise shade of the moment before danger, when your body is making its final negotiations with itself about what it is willing to do. Sarah watched her teammates' faces in that light. Webb, impassive and already far away in his head, running the breach sequence, she could see him running in his eyes. Petty Officer Second Class Cole Briggs, the youngest operator on the team, 24 years old and good in a way he didn't quite know yet, his right hand absently touching the radio on his chest rig. Tommy, who met her eyes across the cabin and gave her a single, small nod that meant something they had never had to put into words. Hayes sat near the front. He was looking at his map board. He did not look at any of them. The jump lights went from red to green at 03:55 hours. Sarah Jenkins went out the door into the desert dark, and the night swallowed her whole. The fast rope was 20 meters. She hit the ground in 3.2 seconds, rolled, came up scanning, and moved immediately to her designated position at the east wall. The compound was ahead of her, a hulking darkness against darker skylights, showing in 2 windows of the main building, and the red glow of a cigarette moving on the south guard tower. The cigarette was on the wrong tower. Intel had it on the north. The first small wrongness. She keyed her radio. "Bravo 1 East Wall in position." "Copy," Hayes said. The assault went to work. She could hear it beginning, the soft sounds of men moving on hard pan, the specific silence of suppressed weapons, the occasional pop that a civilian might have mistaken for something benign. She kept her sector northeast quadrant, eyes moving in the disciplined pattern she had learned so long ago it felt like breathing. And then the world came apart. The first RPG hit the main building at 0401 hours, and it was not fired from inside the compound. It came from the ridge to the west, which was 200 meters outside the compound perimeter, which meant there were fighters outside the perimeter, which meant the intelligence was not 60 to 80 personnel. Sarah processed this in the time it took the fireball to bloom and fade. Contact west outside perimeter. She was already transmitting even as the second RPG came in, and the third, and then the compound's inner gate blew open, and the insurgents started coming out of the ground itself, literally from trapdoors in the hardpan that the 60% mapped subterranean network had hidden, and there were not 60 to 80 of them. There were hundreds. All elements. I've got fighters from subterranean positions, multiple vectors. Fall back. Hayes' voice on the radio, and she registered this in some cold, separate part of herself. He was calling the retreat less than 4 minutes into the assault. All elements fall back to alternate LZ. We have personnel still. She was moving, firing at a muzzle flash to her left, dropping the shooter, moving again. We have personnel not at exfil. The RPG that hit the building she was moving past came from her right, from a position she hadn't seen from a fighter who had been lying in the dirt for God knew how long, waiting for exactly this moment. The blast picked her up and threw her like she was nothing, like she was a doll, like the physics of the world had simply decided to renegotiate their relationship with her body, and she hit the wall with an impact that she felt in her teeth, in her spine, and her vision. And then the wall came down on top of her, and the noise stopped. Not silence. The noise stopped. There's a difference, and Sarah Jenkins in the last moment before consciousness left her understood it precisely. Silence is the absence of sound. The noise stopping is something closing around you. Something final. Something that says here. This is where it ends. She thought the water in the Camelback. 3 days. Then she thought nothing at all. She woke to darkness and weight. The darkness was absolute, and the weight was the weight of a collapsed wall. And the heat was already building because it was coming on morning in the desert, and the desert did not do anything by half measures. She was breathing. This surprised her. She assessed herself in the methodical way she'd been trained, starting at the head and moving down concussion, almost certainly. Blood on the left side of her face from something she couldn't see. Right shoulder, she tried to move it and stopped when the pain hit her like a second wall coming down. Dislocated, possibly fractured. Ribs left side, at least 2. Legs, she moved them both, responded pain, but mobility. She was alive. She was alive, and she was under rubble in a hostile compound in the desert, with the sounds of distant movement telling her that the fighters had not left. She reached for her radio. She tried 3 times before she understood that it was not going to answer her. She lay in the dark under the weight of the wall, and she thought about Hayes, who had ordered the retreat. She thought about Tommy, who she hoped had made the alternate LZ. She thought about the water in her Camelback, which was still there. She could feel the bladder against her back, and about the canyon network she had memorized, and about the distance to the nearest American position. She was not angry yet. The anger would come. But right now, in this first raw moment, what she felt was simpler than anger and more dangerous. She felt certain that she was not going to die here, certain that she was going to get out, certain that she was going to finish what they'd come here to do. She began slowly and with enormous pain to move the rubble. It took her 2 hours and 40 minutes to get free of the wall. She tracked it by the changing quality of the heat and the sound of the compound above her, which told her it was approaching 700 hours, and the fighters were organizing, moving through the wreckage, looking for survivors of the assault team. She moved with the patience of someone who understood that patience right now was the only weapon she had left. No sound, no light, no hurry. When she finally pulled herself out of the rubble and into the brutal morning light of the desert southwest, she lay flat against the ground and did not move for 11 minutes. She counted them. 11 minutes of stillness in the shadow of the collapsed wall, while 2 fighters walked within 40 meters of her and did not look in the right direction at the right time. Then she took her bearings. She checked her kit. Her primary weapon was gone, lost in the blast. Her sidearm, the Glock 19, was still in its holster, 2 magazines plus 1 in the chamber. Her knife, her IFAK, her water. The radio that was dead and that she kept anyway because she had not yet given up on it and would not give up on it because giving up on things was not in her operating parameters. She looked at the canyon network to the east. Then she looked at the compound's main building where Omar al-Bashari was presumably still alive, still protected, still there. She made a calculation that most people presented with her current situation alone, injured, outgunned by hundreds of armed fighters, no communication, no support would not have made. Most people would have calculated survival extraction reporting. Sarah Jenkins calculated something different. She calculated the distance to those canyon walls. She calculated the water she was carrying. She calculated her pain tolerance, which had been tested enough times that she had accurate data on it. She calculated the subterranean network which had produced those trapdoor fighters and which must connect the compound to the canyon system, which meant there were entrances to it, somewhere outside the perimeter entrances she might be able to use given time and patience, and a certain willingness to hurt, in ways that would have hospitalized most human beings. She did not think about the fact that command had written her off. She did not think about Hayes, not yet, because Hayes could wait and the mission could not. She did not think about Tommy, though she thought something adjacent to him. She thought about the specific quality of that nod he had given her in the helicopter across the cabin in the red jump light, and she held on to it the way you hold on to something warm when the cold is trying to get at you. She began to move. She moved east toward the canyon, staying low and using the terrain and using the shadows and using every fragment of cover the desert offered her. She was bleeding from the head wound, and her shoulder was screaming at her, and two of her ribs were grinding together in a way that made every breath a private argument with her own body. She moved anyway, because movement was survival and stillness was not. She had 3 days of water and the Canyon Network to learn and a warlord to find. She had been underestimated her entire career. She had been underestimated at BUD/S when the instructors bet on how quickly she'd ring out. She had been underestimated in Fallujah when her then team leader put her on Overwatch instead of the assault element, and she called the shot from 400 meters that kept 3 of his guys alive. She had been underestimated this morning by David Hayes, who had put her on a perimeter and signed her KIA report. She was certain he had already signed the KIA report. She knew him well enough to know he wouldn't wait before the dust from the blast had finished settling. She had been underestimated every single time, and every single time the people who underestimated her had eventually been confronted with what they had chosen not to see. Omar al-Bashari was about to become the latest in a very long line. She reached the canyon mouth at 10:43 hours. The heat was fully awake now, aggressive and personal, and she stopped in the first real shadow she'd found since leaving the rubble and allowed herself 60 seconds to rest. She drank carefully, not as much as she wanted, a measured amount calibrated for 3 days of unknown duration, and she looked back at the compound now 2 kilometers behind her, and she made herself a promise. She made it quietly the way she did most things, not to anyone, not to God or the Navy or the memory of every person who told her she didn't belong. Just to herself in the specific private language of someone who had decided. She was going to walk back out of this desert. She was going to bring Omar al-Bashari with her, and she was going to do it by herself because apparently that was what the situation required. She turned back to the canyons. She began to plan. She had 63 rounds left. She counted them the way a drowning person counts their breaths, not because counting helped, but because knowing was better than not knowing. Glock 19, 2 full magazines and 9 in the chamber. 63 decisions, 63 last resorts, 63 reasons to make every single one of them count. The canyon wall at her back was still holding the night's cold when she heard the first patrol. She didn't see them. She heard them, the particular cadence of men walking without urgency, the clink of metal on metal that told her at least 2 of them were carrying AKs with loose sling hardware. Amateur equipment discipline. She filed it away. Amateur equipment discipline usually meant amateur tactical discipline, and amateur tactical discipline was something she could work with. She pressed herself flat against the rock and controlled her breathing, the way she'd been taught to control it a decade ago in a freezing pool in Coronado, California by an instructor who told her that the body follows the breath. Slow it down, slow everything down, make yourself smaller than you already are. The patrol passed within 18 meters of her. 3 men. She tracked them by sound until they were far enough gone that the desert swallowed them, and then she allowed herself to exhale. Day 1, hour 11. She was still alive and she was still thinking clearly, and those were the only 2 metrics that mattered right now. She had found the first entrance to the subterranean network at 13:40 hours the previous afternoon, tucked into a rock formation at the base of the canyon's eastern wall, a steel hatch padlocked, covered with a tarpaulin that had been there long enough to have sand baked into its fibers. She had not tried to open it. Not then. She had marked its position in her memory with the precision of someone who understood that the map in your head was the only map you could trust, and she had moved on. Cataloging building the picture that Command's 60% mapping had failed to complete. She had found 3 more entrances by nightfall. She had identified 2 guard rotation patterns tracked by the patrol schedules she observed from her position in the canyon shadows. She had located what she believed based on the frequency of radio traffic emanating from a specific section of rock face was a communications node buried inside the canyon wall, which meant al-Bashari's people were not just using the compound. They owned the canyon. They had built something under it, something substantial, something that had taken months and money and planning, and that the American intelligence apparatus had mapped to 60% confidence because the other 40% was down here in the dark, where she was now sitting. The irony was not lost on her. Hayes had put her on perimeter security because he didn't trust her judgment. Her judgment was at this moment the most complete picture of the enemy's actual position that American forces possessed. She was the intelligence. She was the only asset on the ground who knew what was actually down here. She pulled out her broken radio again. She had done this 11 times since crawling out of the rubble, Each time she powered it on, it gave her the same thing carrier signal. No connection, the digital equivalent of a scream into a void. She powered it on for the 12th time. Carrier signal, no connection. She powered it off and put it away. She thought about Tommy. She wondered if he'd made the alternate LZ. She wondered what he'd been told about her. She wondered if he believed it. She decided that he didn't. Tommy Riggs had never once looked at her with the particular blindness that Hayes carried like a badge. He would not believe a KIA report without a body. He would push. He would ask questions that made people uncomfortable. She held on to that the way she'd held on to the thought of him in the rubble, not sentimentally, but practically the belief that someone was looking for her was a resource as real as the water in her camelback. At 0200 hours on day 2, she made her first move. The sentry at the canyon's north entrance was alone. He had been alone for the past 4 hours, which told her either the patrol rotation had been shortened due to the previous night's assault chaos, or someone had made a scheduling error. Either way, alone was a gift. She moved toward him from downwind with the slow deliberateness of someone who has learned that speed is not the point. Control is the point. Speed is what happens when control is fully established. She took him from behind with her forearm across his throat and her body weight doing the work her injured shoulder couldn't. He didn't make a sound that carried. She held the position until his body made the decision she needed it to make, then lowered him to the ground. She checked his kit, AK-47, 3 magazines, a handheld radio, a water bottle, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a written patrol schedule in Arabic, which she read because she had spent 18 months in language training specifically for moments like this one. The patrol schedule told her 3 things. First, the compound was now operating at elevated alert status following the assault. They expected a follow-up strike, which meant they were looking up and out at the sky at the perimeter, not at the canyon floor where she was moving. Second, al-Bashari had relocated. He was no longer in the main building. He was in the cave system, the deepest section of the subterranean network, the section that the 60% mapping had not reached. Third, and this was the thing that stopped her breath for a full 3 seconds, there were 2 American prisoners being held in a secondary chamber of the cave system. Not killed, held. She read that line 3 times. She read it in Arabic, and then she translated it in her head, and then she read it again to make sure she hadn't made an error born of fever and dehydration and wishful thinking. She had not. 2 American prisoners. The wording used was consistent with military captives, not civilian. She sat in the dark of the canyon with that information, and she felt the mission change shape around her. It had been survive and report. Then it had become survive, gather intelligence, and find a way to complete the original objective. Now it was something larger and more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. And she had 62 rounds and a dislocated shoulder and a fever that had been climbing since midday, and she was going to do it anyway. She took her dead sentry's radio. She didn't key it, too much risk, but she kept it because a radio that could receive was still a window, even if it wasn't a door. She moved deeper into the canyon. By 0630 hours on day 2, she had eliminated 3 sentries and mapped 6 of the subterranean entrances. Her shoulder had gotten worse in the night. The joint had been grinding in a way that suggested the original assessment of dislocation had been optimistic, and there was swelling. Now that was beginning to limit her grip. She treated it with what she had, which was a compression wrap from her IFAK, and the specific kind of stubbornness that doesn't require medication. She rationed her water with the discipline of a person who understood that thirst was information, not emergency. Thirst told you where you were. Panic was what killed you. At 800 hours, she heard something on the capture radio that made her stomach drop. The transmission was brief, and in a regional Arabic dialect, she had to work slightly to parse. A voice she didn't recognize, giving what sounded like a status update. And then another voice clipped, authoritative, accented, that she recognized immediately. Not from having met him. From the intelligence briefings. From the surveillance audio she'd listened to 17 times in the week before the mission. Omar al-Bashari, alive, below her, speaking into a radio 40 feet under the canyon floor. He said, translated, "The Americans won't come again. Not soon. Increase the schedule for the transfer. 3 days, not 5. Transfer." She didn't know what was being transferred. She knew it was bad. She pressed herself against the canyon wall and thought with the rapid, disciplined intensity of someone running a calculation that has a time limit on it. 3 days. Al-Bashari was accelerating his timeline because he believed the assault had scared off American forces. He wasn't wrong about the scare. Hayes had retreated so fast, it had probably read on satellite imagery as a rout. He was wrong about the consequence. Because the one American force he needed to worry about wasn't in the air and wasn't on a FOB filing incident reports. She was 30 meters above him, listening to his radio traffic with a captured receiver and a head full of operational detail that he had no idea existed. She allowed herself the small, cold satisfaction. Then she went back to work. The approach to the cave system's main entrance took her 4 hours. Not because the distance was great, but because the canyon floor was now populated with fighters at a density that required her to move in increments that sometimes measured in inches. She used every piece of cover. She used the shadow schedule she'd been tracking since day one, the way the canyon walls blocked and redirected light at predictable intervals. She used the patrol gaps she'd memorized from the written schedule. She used more than once the kind of absolute physical stillness that most people cannot maintain for more than a few minutes, and that she could maintain for as long as the situation required because she had been trained to it and had then trained herself past where the training ended. She neutralized 2 more sentries. She was down to 58 rounds. Her ribs were a constant low-grade fire on her left side that flared into something acute every time she had to move fast. Her head wound had reopened sometime in the night, and she'd sealed it again with the butterfly closures from her EFAC. She had a fever. She knew she had a fever because the canyon walls occasionally shimmered slightly in her vision in a way that canyon walls do not actually shimmer. And because her hands had developed a fine tremor that she could control but couldn't eliminate, she controlled it. She kept moving. At 1400 hours on day 2, she found the prisoners. They were in a side chamber off the main tunnel, a space roughly the size of a large closet secured by a chain-link door, with a padlock that was newer and better quality than the one on the external hatch. Someone had thought carefully about what to secure and what not to. She heard them before she saw them, a low voice, and then another English, talking in the careful quiet of people conserving energy. She approached the door from the side and spoke before she looked in, because appearing suddenly in front of 2 captive military personnel who had been down here for God knew how long is a fast way to get yourself announced to every fighter within earshot. American, she said barely above a whisper. Friendly, don't make noise. A beat of absolute silence, then, say again. I am a U.S. Navy SEAL. I am one person. I need you to stay very quiet and tell me your status. Another silence. Then a different voice, older, rougher, with the quality of someone who had been managing pain for a while. Petty Officer 2nd Class Daniel Ortega, 75th Ranger Regiment. I've got a broken arm and my partner is mobile. Who the hell are you? Chief Petty Officer Sarah Jenkins, she said. I'm here because this mission isn't over. She heard Ortega exhale, not relief exactly, but the sound a man makes when something he had stopped allowing himself to believe becomes real. Jenkins, they said the radio traffic we caught pieces of, they said the assault team was gone. Extracted. They extracted, she said. I didn't. You're alone. Right now, yes. Chief Jenkins, the second voice said, younger, steadier, with a control that told her this one had been working hard to keep himself functional. Specialist Ray Dominguez, what's the plan? She looked at the padlock. She looked at her kit. She made the calculation. I'm going to get you out of that door. Then you're going to stay behind me and do exactly what I tell you the instant I tell you. No questions, no hesitation. Can you do that? Yes, they said, together with the unanimity of people who have been waiting for exactly this moment. The padlock took her 9 minutes and a piece of the sentry's AK she shouldn't have needed but did. 9 minutes during which the tunnel stayed quiet and her fever tried to make the walls shimmer, and she made a private deal with her own body, not now, come apart later. Not now, her body understanding the terms complied. The door opened. She got her first look at them. Ortega with his arm cradled against his chest, Dominguez with a split lip and eyes that had the specific quality of someone who has been in the dark long enough to make peace with it. They were alive. They were functional. She felt something move through her that she didn't name because naming it would cost time she didn't have. Move, she said softly. Stay low. Follow my exact path. She led them back through the tunnel system the way she'd come in, using the route she'd mapped the shadow corridors, the timing gaps. Ortega moved well despite the arm. Dominguez moved better. He had a military economy of motion that told her he'd run this kind of thing before, or at least drilled it enough that the muscle memory held. Even now, they didn't speak, they breathed, they moved. At the first junction, she held up a fist, and they stopped instantly perfectly, and she listened to a patrol pass overhead, boots on hard pan, that clink of loose sling hardware, and waited until it was gone and kept moving. They reached the secondary exit at 16:18 hours. She pushed the hatch up 2 inches, read the light in the sound and the absence of movement, and pushed it fully open. The desert heat hit them like a wall. She got them into this canyon shadows, and she looked at them, and she looked at the canyon system ahead, and she made her next calculation. She had 2 survivors to protect now, 58 rounds of fever, and al-Bashari still below her in the cave system. The mission had not changed. It had expanded. Those were different things. There's a forward operating base. She said 21 kilometers northeast. Can you make it? Ortega and Dominguez looked at each other. Can we make it? Ortega repeated, and there was something in his voice that might have been humor in a different context. Chief, we just spent 4 days in a hole in the ground. We can make anything. Good, she said, but you're not going that way yet. Dominguez looked at her. Where are we going? Back in, she said. Both of them went still. Al-Bashari is still down there, she said. I came here for him. I'm going to finish that before we leave. Ortega stared at her. Chief, you've been out here alone for what, 2 days? Going on 3. You're running a fever. Your shoulder is... He gestured at the way she was holding herself. The slight compensation, the right arm, that wasn't moving quite the way an unwounded person's arm moved. And you want to go back in there. I need you two to move northeast and stay in the canyon shadows, she said. I'll follow when I'm done. If I'm not out in 4 hours, keep going to the FOB and report everything I've told you. That's not, Dominguez started. That's the mission, she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It had the quality of something that has been tested past the point where volume matters. Al-Bashari accelerated his transfer timeline. 3 days. If he moves whatever he's moving, people die. American people. And I am the only American who knows where he is right now. So I'm going back in. Neither of them argued again. Ortega looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man revising something he thought he had already understood. Come back out, Chief, he said. It wasn't quite an order, and it wasn't quite a plea. It was the specific thing that exists between those two, the thing that soldiers say to each other in the moment before someone goes into the dark. That's the plan, she said. She waited until they were moving northeast along the canyon wall, 2 shapes becoming shadow, and then she turned back to the hatch. She looked at it. She breathed. She made the private deal with her body again one more time. Just one more time, and then you can rest. She went back in. The tunnel was exactly as she'd left it. The fighters were where she expected them to be because she had spent 36 hours learning them the way you learn the thing that is trying to kill you when you understand that knowledge is the only advantage you have. She moved through the tunnel with the slowness that was not hesitation, but its absolute opposite, the deliberate, controlled advance of someone who knows exactly where they are going and exactly what they are going to find when they get there. She was 50 feet from al-Bashari's position when she heard him speaking again. The same voice from the radio, intercept, but closer now, real physical present. He was talking to a subordinate in rapid Arabic about the transfer, about the route, about the assets waiting at the northern rendezvous. He was thorough. He was careful. He was making plans with the confidence of a man who believed the threat had been neutralized. She stopped. She pressed her back against the tunnel wall. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, and she let the fever try to take her. And then she pushed it back, the same way she pushed back everything that tried to take her, methodically and personally, because now was not the time. She had 58 rounds and 1 chance in a mission that command had written off as a failure before the dust had settled. She checked her grip. The tremor was there. She controlled it. She moved forward the last 50 feet with the precision of someone whose entire career had been building to a moment exactly like this one, in a tunnel exactly like this one against an enemy who had made the fatal error of believing that what he couldn't see didn't exist. Omar al-Bashari heard her when she was 6 feet away. She saw the moment he understood his body changed, the quality of his stillness changed, and he turned with the speed of a man who had survived a very long time by reacting to things he shouldn't have been able to detect. He turned fast. He turned and found the barrel of a Glock 19 2 feet from his face, held by a woman with blood dried on the side of her face and eyes that had the particular clarity of someone operating well past the point where most people stop. He said something in Arabic. She translated it in real time. He said, "You are alone." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. He was recalibrating. She could see him doing it, measuring the distance between them, measuring the angle to his bodyguard who was behind him, and to the left, measuring whether the hand holding the weapon was steady or shaking. He was a man who had survived 4 years of American attempts to capture him by being smart and thorough and ruthless, and he was applying all of that now in the last 3 seconds before he understood it wasn't going to help him. "You came back," he said in English, this time accented but precise. "They left you and you came back." "I had unfinished business," she said. He looked at the Glock. He looked at her eyes. And then he did the thing that surprised her, not because she hadn't anticipated it, she had, but because the speed of it was a reminder that this man had not survived 4 years by being slow. He lunged sideways and screamed for his bodyguard in the same motion, a coordinated practice movement that was designed to put a human shield between himself and the shooter. She was faster. She put the bodyguard down with 1 round before he was fully upright. She caught al-Bashari's arm before he completed the lunge, used his momentum against him, the way her shoulder screamed at her not to, and brought him down to the tunnel floor with her knee on his back and the Glock at the base of his skull. He struggled. She applied pressure to the nerve cluster in his wrist that ended struggles, and he went still with a sharp intake of breath that was the sound of a man encountering a level of technical competence he had not expected. She said quietly into the back of his head, "Omar al-Bashari, you are a prisoner of the United States Navy. You will not be harmed if you cooperate. If you don't cooperate, I will find a way to make the next 21 kilometers extremely uncomfortable for you. Do you understand?" A pause, then yes. "Good," she said. "Get up. We're going to walk." She zip-tied his wrists with the restraints from her kit she had, 4 of them. She had packed 4, because details like that were the difference between operators who came home and operators who didn't. And she got him upright and moving toward the exit, and she did not think about the fever or the shoulder or the ribs or the 57 rounds she had left. She thought about the hatch ahead of her and the desert beyond it and the 21 kilometers northeast and the FOB, where 2 Rangers she'd pulled out of a hole in the ground were going to arrive ahead of her with a story that no one was going to believe until she walked through the gate behind them. She pushed the hatch open. The desert hit her again with its full weight of heat. Al-Bashari blinked in the light and stumbled slightly, and she steadied him without loosening her grip because she was not going to lose him to a stumble in the dirt after everything it had taken to put her hand on him. She looked northeast, 21 kilometers of open desert and canyon and enemy territory between her and the end of this. She started walking. She had been walking for 40 minutes when al-Bashari decided to test her. He stumbled deliberately. She clocked it in the first 1/10 of a second, the way his weight shifted before his foot moved the tell of a man manufacturing a fall rather than experiencing one. He went down on one knee, and when she reached to pull him up, he twisted hard to the left, using the ground as a pivot point, trying to get his bound wrists in front of him where they'd give him leverage. It was a good move, practiced. The kind of thing a man developed over years of anticipating exactly this situation. She had anticipated it 40 minutes ago. She let him complete the twist, used his momentum to spin him face first back into the dirt, and put her knee between his shoulder blades with enough weight that he understood the conversation was over before it began. She was not gentle about it. Her shoulder screamed. She did not acknowledge her shoulder. "That's 1, she said. He was breathing hard into the ground. "1 what?" "1 attempt. You get 3 before I decide carrying you is more efficient than walking you." She pulled him back upright. "The 3rd one will be painful for both of us, but significantly more so for you. Are we clear?" A pause. She could feel him recalibrating again, the way she'd felt it in the tunnel, that particular quality of stillness that meant a smart man was updating his threat assessment. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "Nobody ever is," she said. "Move." He moved. The Canyon network that had been her ally for 2 days was now a liability. Every piece of cover that had hidden her from his people also hid his people from her, and she was no longer the hunter working a known patrol schedule. She was moving in the open, or as close to open as the terrain allowed, with a high-value prisoner who his organization would not abandon without a fight. She had to assume they were already looking. The bodyguard in the tunnel would be found. The missing sentries would be noticed. The timeline was compressing, and she could feel it the way you feel weather coming, not see it, feel it. She pushed the pace. Al-Bashari kept up without being told to. She noted this. A man who stayed in physical condition despite living underground was a man who had always believed he might need to run. He was intelligent and he was disciplined, and he was going to be very valuable to American intelligence services if she got him to that FOB, and she was going to get him to that FOB. But right now she needed him to move faster, and she communicated this by the simple method of moving faster herself and maintaining her grip on his arm in a way that left him no choice but to match her. At the kilometer 3 mark, she heard the radio crackle. The captured radio she'd taken from the first sentry, she'd kept it clipped to her kit and kept it on receive only since extracting Ortega and Dominguez. It had been mostly traffic. She already knew patrol check-ins, status reports, the ordinary noise of a security apparatus maintaining itself. But this was different. This was urgency. A voice she recognized as a patrol leader from the compound's eastern section, speaking fast, saying that the tunnel entrance had been found open and there was blood on the floor, and Al-Bashari was not responding to radio. They knew. She moved her grip from Al-Bashari's arm to the back of his collar, and she picked up the pace from fast to something that wasn't quite running, but was close enough to it that the difference was academic. They found the tunnel, she said. Yes, he said. The high wish will all come. How many? He was quiet for 2 steps. She tightened her grip on his collar. How many and where do they stage from? Another beat, then 40, perhaps 50. They stage from the North Canyon entrance, which means they will be ahead of you within, he calculated. She could hear him doing it. 20 minutes, perhaps less. She processed this without breaking stride. 40 to 50 fighters ahead of her. She had 57 rounds and a high-value prisoner she could not lose, and a fever that was making the distant rocks look like they were breathing. She ran the numbers, and the numbers were not good, and she ran them again anyway because that was what you did when the numbers weren't good. You looked harder at them until you found the angle. She found the angle. They stage from the North Canyon entrance, she said, which means they have to go through the canyon to reach me. Yes, and the canyon has one primary path at the 2-kilometer mark. She felt him go still in her grip, the specific stillness of a man understanding that the person holding him knows his terrain better than he expected. How do you know about the primary path? I've been here 3 days, she said. Keep moving. The choke point at the 2-kilometer mark was a natural bottleneck where the canyon walls narrowed to a passage barely wide enough for 2 people abreast. She'd noted it on day 1 as a vulnerability. From the wrong direction, it was a kill box. From the right direction, it was a gate she could hold. She had 57 rounds, and she only needed to hold it long enough. Long enough for what her operational mind asked. Long enough for Ortega and Dominguez to reach the FOB, report her position, and get air support, or QRF moving in her direction. She ran the timeline. They'd been moving northeast for roughly 2 hours. Ortega's broken arm was going to slow them. Call it 3 to 4 hours before they reached the FOB perimeter. Then reporting time verification spinning up a response. She needed to buy 6 hours minimum. She had 57 rounds and a choke point and a prisoner she was not letting go of. She reached the choke point at what she estimated was 1840 hours. She positioned herself at the southern mouth of it with Al-Bashari in front of her, close to the wall on her right side, and she waited. Her shoulder was a sustained emergency, now the swelling significant enough that the joint was moving wrong, the pain spiking from background noise to something that demanded attention every time she raised her right arm. She stopped raising her right arm, except when she needed to. She had a Glock, and she could shoot it left-handed, not as well, but well enough, and well enough was what she had. Al-Bashari was watching her. She could feel his attention, even though she wasn't looking at him directly. He was evaluating, still recalibrating, still running his own calculations, still looking for the moment she gave him an opening. You won't find it, she said without looking at him. I'm not looking for anything, he said. You are. You've been doing it since the tunnel. She glanced at him, then briefly the way you check a gauge something you want to monitor without fixating on. You're looking for the moment the pain gets loud enough that I lose focus. I want you to understand something. The pain has been loud since yesterday morning. It hasn't cost me anything yet. It won't cost me this. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she hadn't expected, not respect as a way, but the thing adjacent to respect that very dangerous people extend to other very dangerous people when they recognize the specific quality in them. How long have you been out here? 3 days. Alone. Until I found your prisoners. Then alone again. He was quiet for a moment. Then, my men will not let you take me. Your men are about to walk through a 40-foot bottleneck, 1 or 2 at a time, she said. I've held worse positions with less. She heard them before she saw them. Sound of multiple men moving fast, not bothering with quiet now because they knew she knew they were coming, the operational calculus having shifted from stealth to speed. She counted footfalls. 8, 10 more, the acoustic properties of the canyon giving her a rough head count that she didn't like but didn't flinch from. Get down, she told Al-Bashari. On your knees against the wall, stay behind me. If I run, you won't make 20 feet, she said simply, and I need you alive. So I'll stop you in a way that hurts instead of a way that ends things. Get down. He got down. She could hear him complying the specific sounds of someone lowering themselves to the ground with bound hands. And then she turned to face the choke point and brought the Glock up, left-handed, and waited. The first fighter came through at a run, and she put him down at 15 meters. The second was close behind, and she put him down at 12. The third and fourth came through together, a mistake, a panic response, 2 men reacting to the sound of gunfire by accelerating into it, and she dropped one and clipped the other, and the clipped one went back through the bottleneck, and she heard him shouting, and the advance stopped. 7 rounds expended, 50 remaining. The canyon went quiet in the way canyons go quiet when everyone in them is suddenly very aware that the person on the other end of the engagement is not behaving the way they planned for. She could hear them on the other side of the choke point. Movement, urgent, whispered discussion, the particular sound of men trying to solve a problem they hadn't expected to have. They were reorganizing. They would try to flank, but the canyon walls at this point were near vertical and would take significant time to scale. They would try to wait her out, but they didn't know her timeline. They might try to negotiate. They tried to negotiate. A voice from beyond the choke point, accented English, carefully calibrated to carry without exposing the speaker. We do not want to harm you. Release the sheikh, and we will let you walk. She said nothing. Silence was better than engagement. Engagement gave them information. We will give you safe passage to your base. You have our word. She almost laughed. She controlled it. Al-Bashari behind her made a sound, quiet, brief, that in a different context might have been a laugh of his own. They're lying, he said quietly. I know. They won't let you reach your base even if you release me. I know that too. Another silence. Then he said something she didn't expect. Why did you come back? You had the 2 soldiers. You could have moved northeast and survived. Why did you come back for me? She didn't look away from the choke point. Her eyes were tracking the top of the canyon wall on the left side where she'd clocked movement 40 seconds ago, a potential climber moving slowly trying to get above her. Because the mission wasn't finished, she said. That is not a complete answer. It's the only one I have. The climber made his move. At that moment, she heard the scrape of boot on rock, and she turned and fired twice in rapid succession without fully extending her arm, the shots placed by sound and training and the specific spatial intelligence that 11 years of operating in the dark had built into her nervous system. The climber came off the wall and hit the canyon floor, and the choke point exploded with renewed gunfire. They'd been waiting for her to turn, and she went flat against the wall and let the rounds pass through the space she just occupied, and she felt one of them clip the fabric of her sleeve close enough that she could feel the displaced air. Too close. She was running calculations she didn't like and revising them in real time, and the revision was not favorable. 40 to 50 fighters, and she'd taken down 6, and she had 50 rounds, and the math was not going to close in her favor through shooting alone. She needed something else. She needed to change the terms. Al-Bashari, she said. Her voice was completely steady. This was one of the things she would think about later in the quiet of a hospital bed, that her voice never shook. Not once across 3 days. I need you to talk to your people. He looked at her from his position against the wall. And say what? Tell them to fall back to the compound and await your return. Tell them the situation is under control. He stared at her. You want me to order my own men to retreat? You have 2 options, she said. Option 1, your people breach this position, and in the process of doing so, something happens to you that neither of us wants. Option 2, you order the retreat, we continue northeast, and you arrive at an American facility alive and intact, which is significantly better for you than the alternative. He was quiet for a long moment. The gunfire had paused. They were reorganizing again. She had maybe 3 minutes before they tried something new. If I order the retreat, he said slowly, you will use me. Everything I know. They will take everything. Yes, she said. She didn't dress it up. He was a man who dealt in hard realities, and she respected him enough, or more precisely respected the danger he represented enough, to give him the unvarnished version. And if I don't order the retreat, he said, I die in this canyon. Possibly. Or you watch me hold this position until air support arrives, and then you get extracted in a way that's significantly less dignified than walking. She looked at him directly. Either way, you're done here. The only variable is how you finish. The voice came again from beyond the choke point, different voice this time, higher authority in the tone. Last chance, release the sheikh. Al-Bashari looked at her. Something moved across his face, not defeat, not quite. The thing that comes before defeat when a very intelligent person runs out of better options and knows it. He raised his voice and spoke in Arabic, fast and authoritative, and she tracked every word. He told them he was alive and unharmed. He told them to pull back to the compound and hold position. He told them the situation was being managed and he would contact them within 24 hours. He told them, and this was the part she hadn't scripted, that the American operator had conducted herself with professionalism and that they should honor that by complying with his order. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Don't read too much into that last part, he said. I simply prefer my men not die unnecessarily. Understood, she said. The sounds beyond the choke point changed, movement receding. The focused, aggressive energy of a force preparing to breach, replaced by the different sound of men, standing down, reluctant, disbelieving, but obedient. She tracked it for 3 full minutes before she let herself exhale. 42 rounds left, north-northeast approximately 18 kilometers. She got Al-Bashari back on his feet and they moved. The next 4 hours were the hardest of the 3 days. The fever was fully in charge now, no longer something she could manage at arm's length, but something living inside her operational space, blurring the edges of things, making distances unreliable. She tracked her accuracy by counting her steps. She had long ago measured her natural stride length and could calculate distance from step count with acceptable precision, and she stayed on azimuth by using the stars, which she'd learned to navigate by in a survival course 8 years ago and had never needed to use for real until now. Al-Bashari walked without attempting escape. She watched for it constantly, the habitual monitoring of a threat. She couldn't stop watching, but he moved with a kind of resignation that was different from his earlier calculation. He was a man processing something. She didn't ask what. She didn't have the bandwidth. At what she estimated was 2,200 hours, he spoke. You have a fever. I'm aware. How long? Since yesterday. He was quiet for several steps. How far? 14 kilometers. You won't make 14 kilometers in this condition. Watch me, she said. Not aggressive, just factual. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. I have never been captured, he said. In 19 years, I have been hunted by 8 different intelligence services. I have survived 3 military raids. I have never been captured. There's a first time for everything, she said. The Americans sent a team of 8 operators to take me, he said. They failed. They retreated. A pause. They sent you instead. They didn't send she said. They left me. He processed that. She could feel him processing it. And you came back anyway. I told you, the mission wasn't finished. Another silence, longer this time. The desert was doing the thing it did at night, releasing the heat and waves, the stored temperature of a brutal day, radiating upward from the ground, so that the cold coming down from above and the heat coming up from below met at exactly the altitude of a human body and did nothing for anyone. She was sweating and shivering simultaneously, which was the fever's particular brand of cruelty, the body's thermostat broken and arguing with itself. She took a water pull, careful, measured. Al-Bashari said, there's water 3 kilometers west, a cache. My people placed it 2 weeks ago. She looked at him. Why are you telling me that he met her gaze? Because you need it, and because he stopped, chose the words. Because I would prefer to arrive at your facility alive, which requires you to remain functional. She studied him for a moment. This was the thing about very dangerous people. The best of them were also in specific circumstances entirely rational. He had calculated that his survival depended on hers. He was acting on that calculation without sentiment. Lead me to it, she said. He led her to it. The cache was where he said it was 2 military-grade water containers buried under a rock formation full. She drank what she needed, and she didn't think about how close she'd been to rationing her last quarter-liter. She refilled her Camelback. She felt the fever back off by some small fraction, not gone, not close to gone, but enough to keep moving. Thank you, she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who doesn't know what to do with gratitude from the person arresting him. Don't thank me, he said. Just keep walking. She kept walking. The FOB perimeter came up at 0347 hours on day 3, not at the front gate, but at the outer wire, the first layer of defensive position that a forward operating base places between itself and a desert that doesn't distinguish between threats. She had been tracking the subtle light signature of the base for the last 2 kilometers, the way artificial light bled into the dark sky at a frequency that was distinct from the stars, if you knew what you were looking for. The challenge came from a guard position. She hadn't seen good concealment, she noted professionally, and it came in the correct format, the right challenge phrase, and she gave the countersign without hesitation. Even though the words felt strange in her mouth after 3 days in the desert, where the only language that mattered was the language of movement and threat and survival. The guard's voice changed when she gave the countersign. Identify yourself. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Jenkins, SEAL Team. And I have a package. She pushed al-Bashari slightly forward into the guard's line of sight. High value, needs to be received. A silence that stretched long enough that she could count it. Long enough that she understood something significant was happening. On the other end of that guard position, a radio call, a verification request, someone pulling a record that said what it shouldn't say. The guard said, Chief Jenkins, our records show you as KIA. She looked at al-Bashari. He looked back at her with an expression she couldn't fully read in the dark, but that contained, she thought, something that might have been the beginning of reluctant admiration. Your records, she said to the guard, are wrong. Get me your duty officer, right now. The gate opened. She walked through it with 57 rounds still in her kit, and Omar al-Bashari's arm in her hand, and 3 days of desert on her body, and a fever that had been running since yesterday morning that she had not at any point allowed to matter. The base was quiet in the way bases are quiet at 0347 hours, the operational tempo of a location that never fully sleeps, but does slow down in the deep hours of the night. Light spilled from the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center, and from the medical tent, and from the row of containerized housing units, where the duty officer was presumably being dragged out of sleep by a guard with an impossible report to deliver. She heard running footsteps. She didn't turn toward them. She stood where she was in the light just inside the gate, holding on to Omar al-Bashari, with the hand that didn't hurt, and breathing the compressed, measured breath of someone who has reached the end of a very long run and is not yet allowing themselves to stop. The running footsteps resolved into a figure she recognized, Tommy Riggs, still in his kit, which told her he hadn't slept, which told her other things she didn't have the words for yet. He came around the corner of the TOC and he stopped. He stopped dead the way you stop when you see something that your eyes are certain of and your brain hasn't caught up to yet. He stared at her. She looked back at him. Chief, he said. His voice had the quality of something breaking very carefully. I need medical and I need your duty officer, she said. In that order. He didn't move for another full second. Then he looked at al-Bashari. Then he looked back at her. Then he did something she had never seen Tommy Riggs do in 2 years of working alongside him. His jaw went loose and he blinked hard twice, the involuntary physical response of a person whose emotional register has been overwhelmed past its normal capacity. They said. He stopped, pulled himself back together with the visible effort of a man putting himself back into operational mode. You walked him out, he said. You actually walked him out. It took 3 days, she said. Tell me Hayes is still on this base. Something moved through Tommy's expression. Hard and certain. He's here. Good, she said. And for the first time in 3 days, the weight of what she was carrying, al-Bashari's arm, her broken radio, her fever, her shoulder, her ribs, the 11 years of being underestimated by men who should have known better, all of it was still there, every ounce of it. She just let herself feel it, briefly, completely, the way you let yourself feel a thing when you finally know it's almost over. Then she started moving toward the TOC. The TOC went silent the moment she walked through the door. Not the gradual quiet of a room becoming aware of something, the instant complete silence of 15 people encountering something that stopped every thought they were having and replaced it with a single identical question. Sarah Jenkins felt it hit her like a physical thing, that silence, and she walked through it the way she'd walked through everything else in the past 3 days, straight ahead, without slowing down, without giving it the power to stop her. She had al-Bashari's arm in her left hand. Her right arm she was holding slightly away from her body because the shoulder had locked up in the last kilometer, and any contact with it now produced a specific white quality of pain that she was managing by not thinking about it. She had blood dried on the left side of her face from the head wound that had reopened twice and been resealed twice. She had 3 days of desert on her skin and in her clothes, and in the particular quality of her eyes, which were clear and very still, and looked at everyone in that room the way someone looks at things when they have spent 72 hours in a state of total situational awareness and haven't yet let themselves come down from it. The duty officer was Captain Richard Mercer, a man she'd met twice before in passing, tall career intelligence background, the kind of person who processed information quickly and showed it in his face before he could stop himself. He was showing it now. His mouth was open by approximately a quarter inch, which for Mercer she suspected was the equivalent of another person's jaw being on the floor. "Chief Jenkins," he said. "Captain Mercer." She moved al-Bashari forward slightly. "Omar al-Bashari, original mission objective. I need him processed, secured, and I need a medical team. Also," she reached into her kit with her left hand, the one not holding the prisoner, and she pulled out the dead radio, the one Hayes had known about, the one that had failed her in the rubble. The one she had carried for 3 days, not because it worked, but because it was evidence. And she set it on the nearest surface with a sound that was quiet, but that carried across the silent room like a gunshot. "I need Lieutenant Commander Hayes in this room. Right now." Mercer looked at the radio. He looked at al-Bashari. He looked at her. 3 separate recalibrations happening in rapid sequence behind his eyes. Then he turned to his staff surgeon and said with the clipped precision of someone who has decided to stop being surprised and start being useful, "Get Hayes, get medical, get the JPRA rep, and I need 2 MPs at this door in the next 4 minutes." The room came back to life around her. She stood in the middle of it, and she did not sit down, not because she wasn't desperate to sit down, but because sitting down right now felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. Not yet. Not until Hayes was in the room. Tommy appeared at her left side. She hadn't seen him come in, but she felt him there, the way you feel the presence of someone whose proximity has become a kind of navigation point. He didn't say anything. He just stood close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she'd needed to, which she didn't. But the option was there, and it mattered more than she would have been able to explain. Al-Bashari was taken by 2 MPs with a professionalism that she watched and approved of silently. He was not hurt. He was not humiliated. As they led him toward the door, he glanced back at her, and she held his gaze for a moment, and the look he gave her was complex, layered with things she didn't have the energy to fully parse right now. And then he was gone through the door, and she exhaled something she hadn't realized she'd been holding for the entire walk from the canyon. The medical team arrived before Hayes did. A Navy corpsman named Vasquez, who took one look at her shoulder and her face and her general state and started talking about immediate transport, and she cut him off at the word immediate. "Treat what you can treat here," she said. "I'm not leaving this room until I've spoken to Hayes." Vasquez looked at her shoulder. He looked at her face. He looked at the expression she was wearing, which was not unkind, but which was also not negotiable. "Chief, your shoulder can wait 15 minutes, she said. "Work around it." He worked around it. He was good, efficient, confident hands, the kind of corpsman who'd been in enough austere environments to know when to push and when to adapt. He cleaned the head wound and closed it properly. He assessed her ribs by palpation and confirmed 2 fractures and told her they weren't displaced, which she already knew because displaced ribs produce a different quality of pain, and she had been monitoring the pain's quality for 2 days. He started an IV line in her left arm for fluids and antibiotics, and she let him do it because the fever was still running, and she had enough operational awareness left to understand that letting the fever go unchallenged through whatever came next was a form of strategic negligence. She was sitting in a chair. She'd accepted the chair when Vasquez asked for the third time because the IV stand needed somewhere to hang, and standing next to an IV stand was more effort than it was worth when Hayes walked through the door. She heard him before she saw him. She recognized his walk, the particular cadence of a man who moved through spaces like he'd decided in advance that the space belonged to him. It had always irritated her. It irritated her now in a way that was cold and very focused. The irritation not of emotion, but of precision. She'd had 3 days to decide exactly what she wanted to say to David Hayes, and she had used the time well. He came through the door and he stopped. The stop was different from how the room had stopped when she'd entered. When she'd walked in, the room had stopped because it was encountering the impossible. Hayes stopped because he was encountering his own consequence, and a part of him had known for 3 days at some level below the level where rationalizations lived that this moment was coming. She could see it in him. The color that left his face was not the color of shock. It was the color of the man watching something he'd buried come back to the surface. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the IV line. Then he looked at her face, at the wound on her head, at the way she was holding her right arm. He was cataloging damage. She realized the specific damage of someone who had been left in the field. Good. She wanted him to see it. She wanted every detail of it in front of him so that the paperwork he'd filed and the decision he'd made and the convenience of her KIA report all had a face attached to them. Chief Jenkins, he said, his voice was steady. She gave him credit for that much. The voice was steady. Commander Hayes. She didn't stand. She had considered whether to stand and decided against it. Standing would have looked like respect or preparation for confrontation. Sitting was something more precise. It was the posture of someone who doesn't need to perform authority because they already have it. Thank you for coming. The politeness landed in the room like a stone. She heard someone near the back wall shift their weight. Hayes looked at Mercer. Captain, I'd like a private... No, Sarah said. Hayes looked back at her. Whatever you need to say to me, she said, you can say here in front of these people. She let a beat pass. The same way you told them I was dead. The room was very quiet. Mercer had his arms crossed in the expression of a senior officer who has decided to let something play out. Tommy beside her was perfectly still. The corpsman Vasquez had stopped moving. That was a field determination based on available information, Hayes said. The building came down. You weren't responding on radio. We had an active... My radio, she said. She nodded toward the dead radio on the table. Pick it up. He looked at it. He didn't move. Pick it up, Commander. He picked it up. She watched him turn it over in his hands, and she watched the moment he found what she needed him to find the damage to the antenna, housing the specific impact pattern that told an informed observer exactly what had happened to it, which was that it had been destroyed in the blast, which was that it had never been a functioning communications device, which was that the silence on her channel had been equipment failure and not operator failure and not death. She had been alive and silent, and the silence had been mechanical, not terminal, and he had known she believed that the silence had more than one possible explanation. He had known and he had chosen the explanation that served him. How long? She said. He looked up from the radio. Excuse me? How long after the blast before you called me? I want the specific time. A silence. The building came down. How long, Commander? He set the radio down. Something in his jaw shifted the specific muscular movement of a man preparing to say something he has already lost control of the framing on. 4 minutes, he said. The number landed. She heard it land in the room around her, felt the quality of the silence change, become heavier, become something that people were going to remember. 4 minutes. 4 minutes between a building coming down on his best operator and the KIA report that ended the search and brought the team home. 4 minutes, she said. I was under that rubble for 2 hours and 40 minutes before I got free. I was alive for 2 hours and 40 minutes while your paperwork had me dead. She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. I then spent 3 days in enemy-controlled territory. Alone. I located and extracted 2 American prisoners of war. I captured Omar al-Bashari, who was the objective of this mission. I walked 21 kilometers through hostile terrain with a dislocated shoulder, 2 fractured ribs, a head wound, and a fever. And I'm sitting here right now. She looked at him without heat, without performance, just the facts delivered with the precision of someone who has had 3 days to organize them. Because you were wrong about the mission, about the intelligence assessment, about what I was capable of, and about what leaving someone behind costs. Hayes stood very still. She had expected him to defend himself, to cite doctrine, to invoke the chaos of the engagement, to produce the rationalizations she'd been anticipating for 3 days. He didn't. He stood with the radio in front of him on the table, and he looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not the defensive anger of a man protecting his position. It was something older and quieter and more difficult to look at. It was a man encountering the full weight of what he'd done and finding that the weight was more than he'd calculated when he'd made the decision. "Jenkins," he started. "Chief Jenkins," Tommy said, quietly from her left side. Not aggressive, just the correction placed with the precision of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment to place it. Hayes looked at Tommy, then back at her. "Chief Jenkins," he said, Captain Mercer moved then, stepping forward in a way that shifted the geometry of the room. "Commander Hayes, I'm relieving you of duties pending a full investigation into the field determination and the circumstances of Chief Jenkins's status designation. MPs." He looked at the 2 military police standing by the door. "Escort Commander Hayes to quarters and hold him pending JAG review." The MPs moved. Hayes looked at them, then at Mercer, then at Sarah. He opened his mouth once and closed it again. Then, in a moment that she would think about for a long time afterward, he did something she had not expected. He looked at her directly without the calculation or the dismissal or the defensive machinery, and he said simply, "I'm sorry." She looked back at him. She thought about the 4 minutes. She thought about the rubble. She thought about Ortega and Dominguez in that underground chamber, and the captured patrol schedule, and the water cache, and the 21 kilometers, and everything that word was supposed to cover. She said nothing. She didn't owe him a response, and she didn't have one that would have been fair to either of them, and silence was the most honest thing she had. The MPs walked Hayes out. The door closed. The room breathed. Vasquez reappeared at her right side, delicate and purposeful. "Chief Jenkins, the shoulder really does need—" "I know," she said. "Give me a minute." He gave her a minute. Tommy crouched down to her eye level, which was the thing he did when he wanted to talk to her and not at her, and she had always appreciated it about him without ever saying so. He looked at her face, at the wound, at the fever brightness in her eyes, at the particular exhaustion that lived not in the body, but in the deeper place where a person stores the energy they use to keep going when the body has run out. He looked at all of it. "Ortega and Dominguez got in 2 hours ago," he said. "They're both in medical. Ortega's arm is being set. Dominguez—" He stopped. His voice had gone slightly rough in a way he clearly hadn't planned for. "Dominguez spent the first 20 minutes after he got here trying to tell anyone who would listen that there was a SEAL operator in the field who needed QRF. Nobody believed him until we cross-referenced his description with your—" He stopped again. "With the KIA report. He's a good soldier," she said. "He told me what you did," Tommy said, "going back in after you got them out. He said," he rubbed the back of his neck, gesture she recognized as Tommy reaching for words that were giving him trouble. "He said he'd never seen anything like it in his life. He said he didn't think it was possible for one person to do what you did out there." She didn't respond to that immediately. She looked at the dead radio on the table, which was evidence and artifact, and 3 days of her life compressed into a piece of broken equipment. She thought about the water cache and al-Bashari leading her to it, which was a story nobody was going to believe in the debrief, but which had happened exactly the way it happened. She thought about the choke point and the 50 rounds she'd come home with, and the patrol schedule in Arabic that she'd memorized so completely she could still recite it. "I did what the mission required," she said to Sarah. He almost never used her first name. He used it now, which told her something about the past 3 days from his side of them. "Are you okay?" She thought about the question. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. "Not yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." He nodded. He didn't push. That was the thing about Tommy. He knew when to push and when to sit with something, and right now he sat with it, and she was grateful in a way that was too large to fit into words, so she didn't try. Mercer came over. He pulled a chair and sat across from her in a way that was less commanding, officer, and more person, which she appreciated. "I owe you an apology on behalf of this command," he said. "The field determination was premature. The search and rescue protocol should have been initiated regardless of the radio silence. That's a failure I'm going to address in the investigation." "I know you will," she said. She believed it. Mercer was not Hayes. There were more Mercers than Hayes in the institution, she reminded herself. She needed to remember that. "Al-Bashari is being processed," Mercer said. "JPRA is on their way. The intelligence value of this capture—" He paused as if searching for an appropriate register for what he was about to say. "It may be the most significant single capture in this operational theater in 4 years. There's also the transfer," she said. She straightened slightly, the mission focus reasserting itself, even now, even here. He referenced a transfer, 3-day timeline from when I took him. "Whatever is being moved, it's moving within the next 24 hours now. The rendezvous is in the north." He mentioned it to a subordinate in the tunnel. She started to reach for the notepad on the table beside her, and Vasquez stopped her arm with a gentle hand on her wrist. "Chief," he said, "I need to debrief." "You need surgery on that shoulder," he said, "and IV antibiotics for the next 12 hours, and then sleep in that order. The debrief will keep for 6 hours." He looked at Mercer, not asking for support exactly, but making clear that the medical opinion was on the table. Mercer nodded. "He's right. Debrief at 1,000 hours. Everything else can wait." She looked at the notepad. She looked at Vasquez. She looked at Tommy. She thought about the transfer of the Northern Rendezvous, the 3-day window that was now inside 24 hours, and she made the specific and difficult decision of a person who understands that the mission and the person running it are both assets, and that burning out an asset solves nothing. 6 hours, she said. "Then I'm in that debrief chair." "Deal," Mercer said. She let Vasquez move her toward the medical tent. Tommy walked alongside her, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him, the way you feel the steadiness of something solid when the ground under you has been uncertain for a long time. Outside the TOC, the base was beginning to show the first suggestion of dawn at the horizon, a lightning that was more absence of dark than presence of light, the desert's version of a slow exhale. She stopped walking for a moment. Just one moment outside in the air that was still holding the night's cold before the day took it back. "Tommy," she said. "Yeah. Did you believe the report the KIA?" He was quiet for 3 full seconds. She counted them. Then no, he said, not for a single minute. She nodded, something in her chest that had been braced for 3 days relaxed by a fraction. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Enough to know that the things she'd held on to in the rubble and under the canyon and in the dark of the tunnel, the thought of him and his nod in the red jump light had not been wishful thinking. It had been accurate intelligence. "Good," she said. "That's good." She started walking again. The medical tent was 60 meters ahead, and the shoulder was in full emergency now that she'd given it permission to be the joint radiating up through her neck and down through her arm in a sustained announcement of everything it had been through. She walked through it. 60 meters was nothing. She had walked 21 kilometers through a hostile desert, dragging the most wanted arms dealer in the Western Hemisphere. She could walk 60 meters to a medical tent. Inside, she could hear Ortega's voice from behind a curtain. He was telling someone about the tunnel, about the moment she'd appeared at the cell door and said friendly and meant it, and the voice telling it had the particular quality of someone still slightly astonished by their own story. She heard Dominguez's voice responding quieter, and then she heard him say her name, Chief Jenkins, with a weight on it that she understood. She sat on the medical cot and let Vasquez take her arm, and she did not think about Hayes or the radio or the 4 minutes. She thought about the mission. Completed. The objective secured. The 2 Rangers alive. The intelligence intact in her head where it had lived for 3 days, ready to be delivered at 1,000 hours to the people who needed it. She thought about the transfer and the 24-hour window and the Northern Rendezvous. She thought about all the things that were still left to do. Then Vasquez said, "I'm going to need you to hold still, Chief." And she held still, and she let the medicine do what the medicine was supposed to do, and she breathed the way she'd been breathing for 3 days, slow, controlled body, following the breath, and she waited for what came next. The investigation into David Hayes was opened by JAG at 0600 hours that same morning. The formal charging document cited multiple violations of field protocol, dereliction of duty, in the failure to initiate search and rescue procedures and conduct unbecoming an officer. Sarah was not in the room when the charges were filed. She was in surgery. But Tommy was there as her informal representative, and he told her about it afterward with the specific, quiet satisfaction of someone who has been waiting a long time for a thing to happen and has finally seen it happen. He didn't fight it, Tommy said. The JAG officer said he sat down, looked at the charges, and didn't fight a single one. She absorbed that. She thought about what Hayes had said in the TOC. I'm sorry. And she thought about whether she believed it, and she decided that what she believed was that he had meant it, and that meaning it did not change what he had done, and that those two things could both be true simultaneously, and that the truth of both of them was something she was going to have to carry for a while. Good, she said. That's good. The debrief at 1,000 hours lasted 4 hours. She sat in a chair in the debrief room with her shoulder immobilized and her arm in a sling and 2 fractured ribs taped, and the fever running at a lower temperature thanks to 12 hours of IV antibiotics, and she talked for 4 hours without stopping, except to drink water. She gave them the patrol schedules and the subterranean mapping and the communications node location and the transfer timeline and the northern rendezvous and every detail of the 3 days that her operational mind had stored with the fidelity of a system that had been built through 11 years of service to do exactly this. The JPRA representative interrupted her twice to ask clarifying questions. She answered both times without consulting notes because she didn't have notes. She had her mind. Her mind was enough. When she described al-Bashari leading her to the water cache, the JPRA rep looked up from his notepad and said, "He voluntarily assisted you." "He did," she said. "Why?" "He said he preferred to arrive alive," she said. "He's a rational actor. He calculated that his survival depended on mine. He acted on the calculation." The JPRA rep looked at his notes, then at her. "Chief Jenkins, in 20 years of doing this, I have never heard a capture account like this one." She considered that. "Neither have I," she said, "but the mission required it." At 1400 hours, Captain Mercer pulled her aside after the debrief. He had the expression of a man carrying news that he's still working out how to frame. "The transfer," he said, "based on your intelligence, we put a surveillance asset on the northern rendezvous point at 0800 hours. 40 minutes ago, we intercepted the transport vehicle, 12 man-pads, 3 crew-served weapon systems." He paused, enough to have taken down 4 or 5 aircraft. She said nothing. She thought about the 17 people already dead from al-Bashari's pipeline. She thought about the number that had not been added to that count. "The transfer was stopped," Mercer said, "because you were able to give us the location, which you were able to give us because you stayed." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to understand what that means, what it actually means." She understood what it meant. She had understood it in the canyon when al-Bashari had mentioned the transfer and she'd made the decision to go back in. She'd known then what was at stake. She just hadn't known the exact number. 12 man-pads, 3 crew-served systems, aircraft that would now not be shot down, crews that would now come home. "Thank you, Captain," she said. He nodded. He started to turn away and then stopped. He turned back. "I've submitted your name for the Navy Cross," he said. "It's not enough, but it's what I have." She held his gaze. "Thank you," she said again, and meant it, and let him go. Tommy found her outside the debrief room. She was leaning against the exterior wall of the building in the afternoon heat, her good arm at her side and her slinged arm held carefully, and she was looking at nothing in particular. Or rather, she was looking at the distance, the specific habit of a person who has spent 3 days in open terrain and whose eyes have not yet remembered how to stop scanning. "You heard," he said, "about the man-pads, yes. And Hayes, Jag formally arrested him at 1300. She nodded. Tommy stood beside her and looked at the same distance. They stood like that for a moment, not talking, the particular silence of 2 people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it to share it. Then Tommy said, "What do you need?" She thought about it. The honest answer had several components she needed. Sleep, and she needed her shoulder to heal, and she needed several weeks in which nobody asked anything of her arm. But those were the needs of the body, and the body's needs were patient. They could wait. What she needed right now in this moment was something simpler. "Coffee," she said. "Real coffee, not whatever they've been making in the TOC." Tommy looked at her. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do in the entire 3 days. He laughed. Not the careful, controlled expression of someone managing a professional relationship, but an actual laugh surprised out of him, the sound of a man whose relief had finally found an exit. "I know where they keep the good stuff," he said. "Come on." She pushed off the wall. She followed him. Her shoulder was a sustained argument. Her ribs were a punctuation to every step. The fever was still there, lower now, a background hum that the antibiotics were working on. She walked through all of it the way she walked through everything straight ahead, without stopping, without letting it have the power to stop her. She had been left behind. She had come back. The mission was complete. The men who needed saving had been saved. The man who had tried to bury her was in military custody. The weapons that would have killed Americans in the air were off the board. And she was walking toward coffee with the one person on this base who had never once in 2 years looked at her like she needed to prove something. It wasn't everything, but right now in the long exhale of 3 days that had tried to kill her, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the specific, uncomplicated sufficiency of a thing earned honestly and completely, with nothing left undone and nothing left to prove. For the first time in 72 hours, Chief Sarah Jenkins let herself feel it. The coffee was terrible. Tommy had promised the good stuff and delivered something that tasted like it had been brewed sometime around the previous administration and kept warm out of stubbornness rather than intention. Sarah drank it anyway, both hands wrapped around the mug, and said nothing about the quality, because the quality was not the point. The point was sitting in a folding chair in the corner of the base's small common area with another human being who didn't need anything from her. And that point was being made perfectly regardless of what was in the mug. Tommy sat across from her and watched her drink it with the expression of someone who knows they've under-delivered but is too relieved about other things to be embarrassed. "It's bad," he said. "It's hot," she said. "That's a generous review." "I've had worse." She hadn't, but she let it stand. They sat for a few minutes without talking. The common area was quiet at this hour mid-afternoon, the base in its operational rhythm, most personnel either working or sleeping in preparation for night shifts. A fan moved air around without improving it. Somewhere outside, a vehicle engine turned over and settled into idle. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a place that was not trying to kill anyone. She was still adjusting to that. "They're flying al-Bashari out at 1800, Tommy said. "I know. Mercer told me. JPRA wants another session with him before transport. They're going to ask if he'll talk voluntarily before they go the formal route." He paused. "Think he will?" She thought about the water cache. She thought about the order he'd given his men at the choke point fallback, "Let her pass." She thought about him saying your records are wrong with the particular tone of someone who respected accuracy even in defeat. "He'll negotiate," she said. "He won't fold, but he'll negotiate. He's a rational actor. He'll calculate what cooperation buys him, and he'll make a decision based on that calculation." She took another sip of the terrible coffee. "He's smarter than most of the people we've taken off the board in the last 4 years. Use it. Don't waste it by treating him like he isn't." Tommy looked at her. "You're going to put that in the debrief follow-up?" "Already did," she said. He nodded slowly. She could see him processing everything, not just the intelligence, but the larger shape of the past 3 days, the way events assembled themselves into meaning when you finally had enough distance to see the whole picture. He had the face of someone doing that assembly work in real time, fitting pieces together that didn't quite line up the way he'd expected them to. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "In the tunnel, when you had him, when you finally had him right there," he stopped, chose the words carefully. "Were you angry at Hayes at the mission, at all of it? Were you doing it for—" He made a gesture that encompassed something he didn't have a word for. She considered the question. She considered it honestly the way she considered everything without the editorial layer that most people applied to their own motivations. "No," she said. "I was doing it because 17 people were dead and would be dead if the transfer went through. I was doing it because Ortega and Dominguez were in a hole in the ground and nobody knew where they were. I was doing it because—" She stopped. Found the real answer, the one underneath the operational one. Because the mission was real. Hayes was real. What he did was real. But none of that made the mission less real. The weapons were still moving. The prisoners were still down there. The problem didn't care about my feelings about the person who'd abandoned me. So I didn't either. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then, "I think that might be the most Sarah Jenkins sentence I've ever heard." She looked at him. Something moved through her, not quite amusement, but the thing adjacent to it that surfaces when someone sees you accurately. "Is that a compliment?" "Absolutely," he said, without hesitation. She finished the coffee. She set the mug down. Outside, she could hear a helicopter not approaching, just present the ambient sound of a forward operating base going about its business in the late afternoon. She tracked it, automatically identified it by rotor frequency as a Black Hawk, filed it, let it go. The operational hindbrain never fully stopped. She'd stopped fighting that a long time ago. "Get some rest," Tommy said. "Vasquez said you need—" "I know what Vasquez said." "Sarah." She looked at him. He had the expression of someone who has decided to say the thing they've been not saying, which on Tommy's face was distinctive because Tommy was generally someone who said things directly, and the occasions when he didn't were therefore noticeable. "You scared me," he said, "for 3 days. I want you to know that. Not because it changes anything, but because—" He stopped, looked at the table. "Because I think you should know that somebody on this base was scared for 3 days, and it wasn't because of the mission." She held that. She let it be real. Let it have the weight it had, didn't manage it or deflect it or translate it into something more operationally comfortable. "I know," she said. "Thank you for not believing the report." "Never," he said, simply completely the way he'd said it the night before. Never like it was a rule of physics. She stood. Her ribs registered the movement with their characteristic commentary, and she absorbed it without acknowledgement. "I'm going to sleep," she said. "Wake me at 17:45. I want to see them transport al-Bashari." He nodded. "I'll be there." She walked to her assigned quarters, a containerized housing unit at the east end of the base, and she sat on the edge of the cot and she took off her boots with one hand because the other one was in a sling, and she lay back and she was asleep before the thought of sleep had finished forming. She dreamed about the rubble, not as a nightmare, not the version where she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't find the edge of the thing pinning her down. She dreamed the true version, the actual 2 hours and 40 minutes. And in the dream, she was doing what she had actually done, moving, assessing, deciding, working the problem. Even in the dream, she was working the problem, and the rubble was not the enemy, it was just the obstacle. And obstacles were simply the terrain the mission moved through. She woke at 17:45 minutes before Tommy was scheduled to knock. She was already sitting up when he knocked. She put on her boots with one hand, which took longer than it should have, and was a problem she was going to solve before anyone tried to use her injury as a reason to question her operational status. And she walked out into the early evening air to watch a piece of unfinished business get finished. The transport was not elaborate. A vehicle to the airstrip, a waiting aircraft, 2 JPRA officers, and 4 MPS forming the escort. Al-Bashari walked out of the holding facility in flex cuffs in a civilian jacket someone had found for him. The desert night was cold and the protocols required humane treatment, and those protocols were real and non-negotiable, regardless of what the man had done. A fact she believed in the way she believed in all the things that separated what they did from what he did. He saw her before the escort reached the vehicle. She was standing 20 meters away outside the perimeter of the transport detail, just present, watching. He stopped walking, not resisting. Escort didn't react, just paused for the fraction of a second it took him to locate her in the crowd and hold her gaze. He said something. She was too far away to hear it. She read his lips. 2 words in Arabic. She translated them. He said, "Well done." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she gave him a single small nod, the same economy of acknowledgement she would have given any opponent who had fought with integrity and lost with dignity. Then the escort moved him forward and he was in the vehicle, and the vehicle was moving, and that chapter of the mission closed with the particular finality of a door shutting on something that will never be exactly this way again. Tommy appeared at her shoulder. "What did he say?" "Nothing important," she said. Tommy looked at her. He didn't push. That was the thing about Tommy. The formal investigation results came down faster than she'd expected. 12 days, which in military justice terms was nearly instantaneous, which told her that Mercer had put significant weight behind it and that the evidence was not ambiguous. David Hayes was formally charged under Article 92, failure to obey a lawful regulation, and Article 134 for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. He was relieved of command. His career built over 16 years was over. She heard this from Mercer in a brief, factual conversation in his office on day 12, and she felt the news land in the way she'd felt most things in the past 2 weeks, clearly without drama, the precise weight of it and no more. "Do you want to be present at the proceeding?" Mercer asked. "No," she said. "I've said what I needed to say. The system can do the rest." Mercer nodded. He looked like he'd expected that answer and respected it. "The Navy Cross ceremony is being scheduled," he said. "Washington wants to coordinate with the JPRA announcement on al-Bashari. There's going to be significant attention." She had been thinking about this. She had opinions about significant attention that were not uncomplicated. "I'd like Ortega and Dominguez included," she said. "They should be recognized. They're being put in for the Army Commendation Medal." "That's not enough," she said. "They were held prisoner for 4 days and walked out through hostile terrain with a broken arm and a fractured jaw, and they did it without complaint and without breaking. That's not a commendation. That's at minimum a Bronze Star." Mercer looked at her. Then he wrote something down. "I'll look at the criteria," he said. "Thank you," she said. And then, because it was on her mind and she believed in saying things directly, "And Tommy Riggs, he held this team together for 3 days while command had me declared dead. He refused to accept the report and he kept pushing for answers, and he was right. That should be on the record." Mercer wrote something else down. "Is there anyone you're not going to advocate for?" "Hayes," she said without pause. He looked up. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the thing an experienced officer's face does when they encounter a response that is both completely appropriate and exactly what they expected. "No," he said, "I don't suppose you will." She left his office and stood outside in the afternoon sun, which was doing what the desert sun always did, making everything very clear, very bright, very present. She thought about the ceremony. She thought about Washington and attention and what happened to a story when it became official, when it acquired the weight of institutional recognition and the particular quality of meaning that came with medals and citations and public record. She had not done this for any of that. She needed to hold on to that. She had done it because 17 people were dead and more would be dead, and Ortega and Dominguez were in a hole in the ground, and the mission was real, and the problem didn't care about her feelings. She had done it because abandonment was not an argument against completion. She had done it because she was Sarah Jenkins, 11 years of special operations, 0 mission failures. And those 3 facts were connected in a way that was not about ego, but about something deeper and more durable, about the specific shape of the person she had built herself into over the course of a career that had never once given her the easy version of anything. Tommy found her there, standing in the sun, which he did with the reliability of a person who has developed an accurate internal compass for where she would be. He handed her a cup of coffee. She looked at it. "Is this?" "I found the actual good stuff," he said. "I asked around. Apparently there's a corpsman in the medical unit who has a private supply he guards like a national security asset. I called in a favor." She took a sip. It was genuinely good coffee. She felt something in her expression shift in a way that was involuntary and possibly visible, and she decided not to manage it. "Thank you," she said. "How'd it go with Mercer?" "Hayes is being charged. The ceremony is being scheduled. I push for better recognition for Ortega and Dominguez and Tommy Riggs." He went still. He stopped. "You put my name in. Editim. You held this team together for 3 days after command declared me dead," she said. "That's on the record. It should be on your record." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone absorbing something they hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. It was the expression people had been wearing around her for 2 weeks. She was getting used to it without finding it comfortable. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know I didn't have to," she said. "I did it because it's accurate. Accurate things should be on the record." She looked at him steadily. "You told me that night in the helicopter that you never doubted me. Then you proved it for 3 days straight. That's not nothing. That's everything." He looked away. He looked at the horizon. She let him have a moment because she understood that some things needed a moment, and because she owed him at minimum 1 moment of not being relentlessly efficient about managing other people's emotions. Then he said quietly, "What happens now for you? What happens next?" She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it in the specific way she thought about operational planning, looking at the terrain ahead, mapping the possible routes, identifying the obstacles. The obstacle at the moment was physical, 6 to 8 weeks of recovery, the shoulder requiring a course of physical therapy, the ribs requiring time, the fever fully resolved now, but leaving the particular tiredness of a body that has spent significant resources fighting itself. After that, the question of operational status, which would go through a medical review and an evaluation and several conversations with people in various levels of command who would have opinions about what she should do next. She had opinions of her own. She always had. "I'm going back to the teams," she said. "When the shoulder is cleared and the review is done, I'm going back." Tommy looked at her. "You know it's going to be different now. After all of this, the attention, the ceremony haze, it changes things. It changes the noise around it," she said. "It doesn't change the work. The work is still the work." He nodded slowly. She could tell he believed her and that he also understood something, that she was still in the process of understanding herself, that the world she was going back to was not entirely the same world she'd left, because she was not entirely the same person. And those two things were connected in ways that were going to take time to map. She had always known what she was capable of. She had known it with the quiet, grounded certainty of someone who has tested themselves repeatedly against hard things and has kept careful records. What the past 3 days had done was not teach her something new about herself. It had made that knowledge public in a way that could no longer be argued with, filed away, reassigned to perimeter security, or declared KIA before the dust had settled. She knew what she was. Now everyone else did too. That was the change. That was the only change that mattered. At 0900 hours on the 14th day, Specialist Ray Dominguez appeared at the door of her quarters. She opened it to find him standing straight, arm no longer in the full sling, but still held carefully, the split lip healed to a thin line. He looked better than the night at the gate, better than the tunnel, better than the 4 days before that. He looked, she thought, like someone who had come through a thing and knew it and was still deciding what to do with the knowledge. "Chief Jenkins," he said. "Dominguez, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said. He looked at her steadily. He had the eyes of someone who had been in the dark for 4 days and had not forgotten what the light looked like while he was there. "I wanted to say it in person. What you did going back in after you got us out, I need you to know that I think about it every day. I'm going to think about it for the rest of my life." He paused, steadied himself. "Ortega, too." "He wanted to come, but his arm is still. He said to tell you that he's naming his daughter Sarah if it's a girl." She absorbed that. She let it be what it was. Not a performance of gratitude, but the real thing, the weight of what it meant to one person that another person had made a specific decision in a dark tunnel at the end of 72 hours of survival. She felt it clearly, completely, without deflecting it into something easier to carry. "Tell Ortega I'm honored," she said, "and tell him the arm is going to be fine." "He knows," Dominguez said. "He says if it's a boy, he's naming him Jenkins anyway." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, the ease of it, the way it came up without being planned. It felt like something unclenching. "Go home," she said, "and both of you, go home and rest." He nodded. He started to turn. Then he stopped the way people stopped when they had one more thing. "Chief, that thing you said when you came to the door of the cell," he looked at her. "You said I am a U.S. Navy SEAL and I am one person and the mission isn't over. I've been thinking about that sentence." He paused. "One person. You said it like it was enough." "It was enough," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded a single definitive nod, the nod of someone filing something permanently, and he walked away, and she watched him go, and she thought about that sentence. One person. The mission isn't over. She had meant it when she said it. She had meant it every time she'd acted on it across 3 days of desert that tried to take her. One person with 63 rounds and a dead radio and 3 days of water and 11 years of knowing exactly what she was. The Navy Cross ceremony happened 3 weeks later. Washington formal, the kind of event that had cameras and statements and officials who used words like unprecedented and extraordinary and above and beyond. She stood at attention and she accepted the decoration from hands that had not been in the desert with her. And she said thank you to people who deserved to hear it, even when the gratitude was complex. And she shook hands with people who would go home and tell this story at dinner tables for years, which was fine. Stories mattered. She knew that. She had told herself a story in the rubble, the story of a person who was going to survive this, who was going to finish this, who was going to walk back out and that story had been the most important weapon she carried. Hayes was not present at the ceremony. He was in the middle of his proceeding. She did not think about him on that day, not because she had forgiven him. Forgiveness was a project she was still early in, and she was going to be honest about that, but because he had become, in the specific accounting of her life, a thing that happened to her rather than a thing that defined her. He had made a decision about her worth, and she had responded to that decision by completing a mission alone that a team of 8 had failed to complete. That was the record. The record was not complicated. After the ceremony, in a corridor outside the main hall, she found a quiet moment with Tommy. He was in his dress uniform, and he looked uncomfortable in it, the way he always looked uncomfortable in it, like a person who has been fitted into something that doesn't account for who they actually are. She understood the feeling. "You did good up there," he said. "I stood still and accepted a medal," she said. "That's not particularly hard. You know what I mean." She did know. She knew he meant the composure, the precision, the way she had moved through the official world of the ceremony with the same quality she moved through everything straight ahead, without stopping, without giving the difficulty of it the power to slow her down. She accepted the acknowledgement the way she'd accepted Dominguez's gratitude, clearly and completely. "Thank you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I heard you've been cleared for return to active operational status in 6 weeks. 5, she said. "The shoulder is ahead of schedule." He looked at her. He was smiling, the real smile, the one that showed up when he stopped managing it. "Of course it is," he said. "Of course it is." She thought about 5 weeks. She thought about the teams that worked the next briefing in a room that smelled like burnt coffee at 0200 hours, the next satellite imagery spread on a steel table, the next mission that someone would hand her in a manila folder, thick with classified photographs. She thought about all of it with the appetite of someone who has tested herself against the hardest version of the thing and knows what she is capable of. Not arrogance, not performance, just the grounded, factual clarity of a person who has been in the desert alone for 3 days and has come back with the mission complete. She thought about the hook on Hayes' face when she'd walked into that TOC. She thought about the 4 minutes. She thought about the rubble and the fever and the choke point and the water cache and the 21 kilometers and al-Bashari's last words in the light of the transport vehicle. "Well done," 2 words in Arabic, the admission of an enemy who had run out of better options and had chosen accuracy over pride. She thought about the moment on day 1 when she'd made a decision that most people would not have made, when she looked at the Canyon network and at the compound and at the distance between her and the nearest American position, and had turned not towards safety but toward the mission. She had done it without drama and without hesitation and without the need for anyone to witness it or approve it or believe she was capable of it. She had done it because it was what the situation required, and she was the person on the ground. She had always known what she was. 3 days in the desert had not created her. They had simply refused to bury her. And that the refusal, the return, the mission completed, and the warlord delivered, and the weapons stopped, and the prisoner's home that was the record. Permanent, irrefutable, written not on paper that could be filed incorrectly or signed in 4 minutes, while a person was still breathing under rubble, but written in the kind of truth that doesn't require a signature, the kind of truth that speaks for itself. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Jenkins, United States Navy SEAL, had been left for dead in enemy territory. She had come back. She had brought the mission with her, and not one single person in the world could write the word "finished" next to her name, because she had already made certain across 3 days and 21 kilometers, and everything the desert had thrown at her that finished was a word she decided. Not them, never them, only her.